Well, good morning again. I'm Steve Wheeler. I'm your host, your chairman for this session, and lovely to see you all. Nice to see so many here. We expected 250. I think there's going to be close to 400 of you in the room. It's always the most popular session. I wonder why. I think it's because we're looking into the future. We're looking at emerging and new technologies and how they can impact on our work-based activities. But I think what you're going to see from our two speakers this morning is also how this impacts on our daily life, full stop. Because some of the technologies that are going to be reviewed today and some of the ideas that come with those technologies, I think is going to be quite astounding. And I'm very excited to be sharing this session. I'm going to just sit back like the rest of you and listen in. But here's the format. This is how it's going to happen. We're going to have two speakers first, right up back to back, and then we're going to have the question and answers right at the end. Okay, because that will give you time to reflect on what's been said. It'll give you time to formulate some questions. And then I'll be coming into the audience with this beast here, and we'll be talking to you and talking about what's been happening and asking questions of the speakers, maybe getting some dialogue going. That's the plan. Okay, so without any further ado, I'd like to introduce a guy who, if you've been at this event before, you'll know him. He's spoken so many times, and every time he comes with something fresh, he's flown in all the way from New York. Are your arms tired, Dave? But no, he laughed. I expected everyone to. Never mind. I was never a stand-up comic anyway. But Dave Kelly is the executive director of the eLearning Guild of the USA, and that's a very powerful group of people. And I know he's going to bring some really interesting things this morning. So I'd like you to welcome Dave Kelly.
Morning. Morning, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. My pleasure to be with you today. As Steve said, I'm going to do the first half of this presentation before I turn it over to Chris. And what I wanted to explore today with you is just some trends. My job at the eLearning Guild, we host conferences and online events throughout the United States. And my job is essentially to follow what's going on in our industry. So what I wanted to do is spend some time with you today going over some of the trends. Now, I only have a half an hour to do that, so I'm not going to go through everything. I'm going to touch on some of the bigger ones and give you some context around it. For me, it's less around the trends and more around the context of what those trends mean. Now, when you do a presentation like this, of course, first thing I want to do is recognize, people always come afterwards and say, can I get your slides? My slides are fairly useless. But they're mostly pictorials to just back up what I'm saying. However, if you want to get more resources, this URL, which I'll show again at the end, is basically all you need. If you like to take pictures of slides that have meaning, this is the only one you need. I'll show this URL again at the end. This will take you to a post on my blog that has my slides, which I've already mentioned are useless. But it has any resource that I'll mention during my talk, as well as a host of additional resources that can help you dig deeper into some of the topics that we're going to discuss here today. And again, I will show that again at the end. Now, when you do a presentation like this, everyone knows the most important slide is your title slide. What is it going to be? What is it going to look like? And kind of thought, well, we're talking about the trends, kind of the soothsayer, looking into the fortune, what are we going to do? Maybe I'd go with that. Then I thought, well, this is really a technology-based session. So maybe I should go with something that is representative of that tech, something that represents the technologies that we're using and how these things are going to be impacting us. I kind of thought deeper. I said, well, what is the essence of what I've been asked to talk about here? Talk about looking into the future, about how technologies are changing the way that we do our jobs, and really predicting the future of what we're going to be doing and how it's going to affect our field. And when I thought about that real core aspect, that predictive aspect, I thought, let's be fully transparent and go with the blindfolded monkey throwing darts. Because the reality is nobody knows what the future is going to bring. And I'm not here today to tell you this is what's changing and how it's going to affect your job. Because the reality is anyone who tells you how your job is going to change without taking the time to learn about you and your job and the context in which you work and the environment in which you work is doing you a disservice. I'm going to talk about trends that are broad, but I'm not here to tell you what the trends mean to you. That you have to do. I'll give you the context to understand how this applies to the work that you do and the choices you want to make with your career. That's my hope here today. I think language is important. One of the buzzwords that we're going to be exploring a lot during my talk here today is this idea of digital learning. I am not a fan of buzzwords. The reason I'm not a fan of buzzwords is because of how I define a buzzword. I personally define a buzzword as a term whose usage is spreading faster than its understanding. And I would definitely throw digital learning under that heading. Digital learning, I think, is a term that has tremendously powerful meaning that we are at risk of voiding out. And it wouldn't be the first time we've done that. Because digital learning is a very different concept than education and training. We are here at the Learning Technologies Expo. I work for the eLearning Guild. I host conferences similar to the ones that we have here in the United States. And I share this with that context in mind. You're going to go downstairs to the Learning Technologies Expo. I would argue that as you're walking around there, you're not seeing learning technologies. What you're seeing are education and training technologies, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is an important difference. There is a difference between education and training and learning technologies. And I'll give you an example to drive home what I mean. I'm willing to bet my house that we've all had a shared experience. I haven't met most of you before today, but I'm willing to bet my house that we've had a shared experience. You're out to dinner with your friends or your family. The drinks are flowing, the conversation is flowing. It's the best dinner party ever. You look as fabulous as the people up on that screen. Best conversation ever, everything's rolling, it just feels natural, and then someone asks a question that no one at the table knows, and it brings this conversation to a grinding halt. Someone will break that silence by saying something. What is it? I'll Google it. That's how that silence is broken in today's world. I'll make a secondary bet that no one has been in that situation, and someone at the table broke the silence by saying, you know, that's a great question. I'm going to log into the LMS and find the answer. And that is not a criticism on the learning management systems. I want to be clear on that. Learning management systems serve a viable purpose in the context of the work that we do. It's not a criticism of that technology. It is a statement on what it means to exist in a digital world. Another thing no one in that situation said is, you know what? I'm a self-directed learner. I'm going to pull out my device and get the answer for myself. That's our jargon. That's our jargon, this idea of self-directed learning. What does it mean if you describe to, so if someone, you said someone did that at the dinner table, you say, describe to me what you just did. They're not going to use the word learning. They're not going to use the idea of I'm educating myself on this. What they're going to say is, I solved the problem. The problem in that particular context is I didn't know, and I had this tool that could get me the answer in the moment. That's learning. That's digital learning. And that's the concept that we really need to be looking, that's the lens through which we need to be looking at the work that we do when we talk about digital learning. Because if you're talking about digital learning and you're using language that is about education and training, you're leaving so much off the table. If you want to understand, I mean this, again, I'm a guy who hosts conferences like this all over the world. I say this with full disclosure. If you want to understand how technology is changing how we learn, this isn't the environment necessarily for that. This is an environment to understand how we train and educate people and how we support the workforce through the technologies. But if you want to understand how technology is changing the way that we learn, you have to look at how technology is changing the way that we live. Because it's that context that is really changing the way that we learn as we live in an increasingly digital world. Now, all of that said, what this discussion is ultimately about is about disruption. Disruption to me, I'm fascinated with language. Disruption to me is a word that I'm constantly fascinated by because people have a visceral reaction to the word disruption. It's either, oh, it's going to disrupt things, it's going to be bad, it's going to be really disruptive. Or it's the techie world of, oh, we're going to disrupt things. Disruption is good. What are we going to disrupt? I don't know. We're going to disrupt it because disruption's good. What are we going to disrupt? Anything. Just be disruptive. What fascinates me about the word disruption is it's completely neutral. The word disruption simply means a change in the status quo. What makes a disruption positive or negative is not the change, but how we react to it. And I think that's an important word to be looking at a discussion like this around, because our world as learning and development professionals is changing. It is being disrupted by a lot of different technologies, which is why there's so many people in this room right now. But I want to give you the context that we've been through this before. How many of you work in a world where you either still do or worked and did classroom training? Most hands going up. Good. I come from an environment where when I first started in this field, I'm aging myself now, this was training. before we even had computers in the environment. But this is what training was for a lot of organizations. And then suddenly, some of you might have lived through this, as I continue to be invited to give talks like this, the percentage of people who lived through this transition is getting smaller and smaller. But there was a time when this is all it was, and then suddenly these computers came around, and we had this idea called e-learning that emerged. And it was a really disruptive change. Now my question to you, my first question is, who was it disruptive to? Any ideas when e-learning emerged? Trainers? Sorry? Those who design and develop? I would give you, I'm sorry, I heard another one? Students. You've identified two of the three that I want to talk about. First one I want to talk about is the learners. Now first, a bit of a disclosure. I work for the eLearning Guild. I am very passionate about the power of technology and how the work that we do can be transformative to people's lives. It's why I love the field that we're in. I truly believe the power to give people the opportunity to learn can be transformative to their lives in a way that nothing else can. All that being said, no one in the history of e-learning has ever been that happy to take a course. But it was really disruptive to the idea of what learning looks like. We are conditioned by 12 plus years of school as to what learning looks like. It looks kind of like this, where you have a teacher who's sharing information with students who want to learn things. And now you want me to sit in front of a computer and no one's going to teach me and I'm just going to learn from what's in here. We take it for granted today because it's so commonplace. But when it emerged, it was really disruptive to the people who had to learn. The next group was also identified, the trainers. This is, when I was a trainer, this was my zone. This was my comfort zone. I had my Word documents, my facilitator guide, my workshop guides. I knew how to lead my in-person workshops. And now you want me to do a drag and drop interaction. What am I dragging? Why am I dropping? And what's happening to my career? That was really disruptive to the world of the trainer. And the other thing that's important to realize, the third one I'll add, is, again, we have to think beyond just the idea of individual people. It was disruptive to organizations themselves. Now again, disruption, positive or negative, it's how we react to it. Organizations, when e-learning first came around, their reaction was extremely positive. I'm sorry, hold on a second here. So instead of flying people to the training center, paying for their hotels, paying for their travel, paying for their per diem, paying for their food, and having them out of the workplace, they can do it at work, in between breaks and such, and we can save all that money. Sign me up. I'm good with it. You could make the argument that when organizations enjoyed that benefit, they leaned a little too hard towards that value proposition. But when it first emerged, it was seen as a positive disruption. So I share that context because we've been through this before as an industry. However, that was one change that was happening at one time. What makes today unique is that there are multiple things happening at the same time. There are multiple forces of disruption that are coming in. Now again, there are a lot of different disruptions that are going on. I'm going to focus on about 6 or 7 of them really quick, and I know Chris is going to go into and give you some specific examples, but I want to talk about 6 or 7 of them that have broad implications beyond just the individual ones. And I'm going to put these in a bit of a chronological order, in the sense of things that are happening more near term, leading up to things that are happening a little bit further out. Now I put that in a broad context. That does not mean that if I say something that this is something that's going on now and you're sitting there thinking, that's not even on our radar, that you're wrong. It also doesn't mean if I say this is 5, 10, 20 years out and you think, we're doing that today, we're too early, doesn't mean you're wrong. You have to put this into the context of your own individual work. That's an important thing here. So I'm going to put this as a broad statement, a broad stroke of these are kind of chronological. So let's jump in. First one. Multi-device learning. How many of you are developing content with multiple devices in mind today? Most of you. Good. What's the common phrase that's used to describe the design with this?
Mobile ready.
I heard somebody say responsive design, mobile ready. Responsive design is the type of design that is often used, which if you're not familiar with that term, essentially means designing in a way that it displays appropriately based on the device that you're using, which is a good thing. I mean, for those of you that were around when smartphones first emerged and we did the really, really cool thing of taking the desktop and just shrinking it onto a screen so you couldn't read anything, responsive design is a really good thing. However, it's not enough. And the thing that I think is important here that applies to all technologies is that it repeats a mistake that we often make with technology in our field. I bring it up in the context of mobile, but it applies to just about any emerging tech. which is that I think we tend to look at these new technologies with the wrong question in mind. We look at it and we say, how do I do what I do through this new technology? And that's a very limiting question because it starts with the definition of what I do. It's one of the reasons that when you think about what mobile learning looks like today, it looks like the desktop experience put on a phone. Think about, let me put it in a different context. Think about how you use your phone. It is 11:30 in the morning. I have probably used my phone somewhere around 68 different times today for probably 50 different purposes, and I have not yet made a phone call. But that's really how I've used my phone today. Think about how you've used your phone today. Now take that piece of knowledge, put it aside. Now compare that to how your organization is using your phone in the context of organizational learning. I would venture to guess there's a gap. That gap is opportunity. That gap is the fact that we're looking at these technologies through the wrong lens. If we look at a technology and say, how do I do what I do with this new technology, then you're going to continue doing what you already do. You have to look at the technology and say, how does this new technology change what I do? What could I do with this new technology that I wasn't able to do before? How can this new technology solve a problem for me that I've been struggling with, or make something that we're doing today more effective? It's not about how you can do what you do, it's how you can do things differently that the opportunity of a new technology exists. So responsive design is a good thing, but it is just, it's treating your mobile devices as a screen. And your screen is so much, your mobile devices are so much more than a screen. It has an accelerometer in it, it has a camera in it, it has GPS knowledge that knows the context of where you are at any given moment. Trust me, Google knows. It has all of that data, but if you use it just as a screen, you're leaving that all off the table. So that applies, it starts with mobile, but it applies across the board. So that's multi-device learning. Next trend that's very interesting to me is this idea of interactive video. Now, I want to be clear about what I mean by interactive video. There are a lot of technologies that are out there today that enable you to create your own unique story at an overly simplified level of a branching scenario of video, where you watch a little snippet of video, you decide what decision that person's going to make, and the video will continue based on that decision, kind of a choose your own adventure model for those of you that are in my age and remember those books. That is an interactive experience, but that's not what I mean in this context. What I'm talking about is the metadata that is attached to video. So for instance, in today's environment, this session is going to be recorded. And if you wanted to find it on YouTube, you could search my name, you could search the title of the session, you could search for things that might be in the session description, in that information, and you might be able to find the video. But you're not going to be able to search a particular thing that I said. And that technology now, it exists today. It's just not evenly distributed. But the ability to feel like, oh man, he made that statement, but I wonder what it was. In a Google search, if you typed in what I said, the fact that the video would be, that information would be included in the metadata and be searchable would be transformative to how useful that is. I am the type of person as a homeowner that I don't like to spend money. I usually start from a place of, if there's a problem, I'm going to try and fix it myself, drive my wife nuts. But where do you think I start in those situations? YouTube. I will go to YouTube to try and solve the problem myself. Now, the challenge is I said I like to be that person who tries to fix things themselves. The reason it makes my wife nervous is I am also not handy. So it is a little thing there. So usually I go to the YouTube video to verify that I can't do this. But it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to solve a problem. It's hard to find the video. But think about it in the context of if I was going to go fix my toilet and I'm going to search under the sound that my toilet is making. And it could pull up the fact that somebody brought that up. Or the ability to take a picture of something and the search results based on the visual data. That technology exists today. And it transforms the ability of YouTube or video in general to be used as a performance support tool. Again, go back to the example I made with Google. People aren't doing this as self-directed learning. They're not doing this for any other context other than I have a problem, I'm trying to solve it. And they're learning in the process of that. And the ability for video to be used in that context is a magnitude of importance in the context of the work that we do that it really transforms the usefulness of video. Data and analytics. We hear a lot about this. We heard a lot about it this morning. I love this slide. I wish I knew who designed this so that I can credit for them, because it really represents, for me, the power of this data and analytics conversation. Just in the sense that it's not, what's the two-word phrase that's always in the data conversation? I heard of it, big data. It's data, but it's really big. And if we're focusing on the big, it's not about the size of the data. It's not even about the fact that we now have technology that can crunch the data. It's about the fact that we now have the solution to inform decisions. That's the power of the big data discussion, is the fact that we can inform decisions and make better practices. Now, I think this is another one of those things I put up here, not only because data and analytics is an important conversation for L&D, but it also bridges towards another issue that I think we have within L&D. There are two ways that you can respond to a trend, proactively and reactively. And if you're in a situation where your L&D department is in a position where they can proactively have a more active approach to data and analytics, a lot of people are using XAPI, the Experience API, and doing things like that in our field. If you're in a position to push that forward and transform how your organization is looking at learning data, that's great, and I empower you to do more of that. But some of you might be in the room and going, we have to deal with what we have. I have the technology that I have. We're not in that space. It doesn't affect me. That's where you're wrong. Because the reality is, this is not an if question. Is this going to affect me? This is a when question. And this is where the idea of proactive and reactive to me comes in. If this is not something you're in a position to drive in your organization, that's fine. It does not relieve you of the responsibility of being part of this conversation. Because at some point, you're going to get a knock on your door from your IT department that says, we've put in some new infrastructure, we've got some new data and analytics strategies going to tap into the LMS, the LRS, whatever you're doing, and we're going to need your partnership in terms of putting this infrastructure together. You don't want to have that moment and say, no problem, just give me 5 minutes to Google everything that you just said. There's a skill I think we need to develop in our field, which I generally refer to as conversational competence. My mother would describe it as knowing enough to be dangerous. But you want to be able to participate in the conversations that your organization is having. You want to understand the direction that they are going from a business standpoint. Even if you're not playing in that space, you want to understand it because it informs your practice and it gets you ready for the day that it does affect the work that you do. Next one, augmented reality. Augmented reality is not there yet. I mean, some of you might be saying, well, it's there. I have it on my phone. I agree. But I personally feel that the mobile AR is nothing more than a stepping stone before it really can transform things. There's a lot of cool things that you can do with augmented reality on your phone. But the challenge is you have your phone in your hand. There's only so much you can do with AR when you're actually holding the AR device in your hand. You put it on your head, and now your hands are free to actually do something. That's where the transformative nature of AR comes in. I tend to think that the AR conversation in our industry is a little misguided. This is not an L&D tool. This is not something that we need to look at and say, how can we use this for L&D? If you're in a position where you are using this narrowly within an L&D purpose, great, more power to you. But it's not so much just that. We don't need to look at this just in the sense of how is this an L&D tool. It's a matter of how is this transforming the work that people are doing. Because we support the work that people are doing in organizations. And if this is emerging as an enterprise productivity tool, that's the future of AR. So people aren't going to use this in training per se all the time, but they might be using it in their work, which means we need to be able to not necessarily use it in the context of L&D in a traditional way, but we need to support it in terms of onboarding people to what it means to use AR or supporting the work that people do that AR is a tool in use. So that's the piece of AR that you need to be looking at. Is not just how do we use it for L&D, but how are the people that we support in our organizations going to be using this, and what does that mean to the work that we do? A lot of times in L&D, it's not so much about how narrowly what we're doing with L&D, but how is the environment in which L&D exists changing, and what does that mean to the work that I do? And AR is a big way to look at that lens. Next one, workflow learning. I struggled a little bit with this slide, how I was going to identify it. I kind of thought I could say workflow learning, micro-learning, performance support, just-in-time training, or whatever buzzword we want to apply to it next. Workflow learning is one of the current ones right now. I know microlearning is a big term right now. None of these are new things. It's, when I was a training director in a bank, before we even had a lot of technology, I was doing this. I didn't have a label for it, but I just described it in the sense of, let's do it with the minimal disruption. Let's find the least disruptive way to get people what they need. The reason that these are buzzwords now is now there's more technologies that are enabling us to play in that digital space than we've ever had available before. I personally like the term workflow learning because it really is a self-defining phrase. It's giving people the ability to learn or solve a problem within the workflow. And organizations are increasingly asking for this. They're not using our jargon, but they're asking for speed, they're asking for people to be able to solve their problems. The other thing that I think is important, workflow learning, we tend to, again, look at it through the lens of L&D. But this is not an L&D conversation. This is how many times have you used a piece of software and there was an issue and you were able to solve it with that piece of software? It's part of user design now. We talk about it in context of workflow learning, but most of the applications that are being developed today, they just describe it as user design. The ability for people to just solve their own problems or recognize when someone is having a problem and give them the appropriate layer of support. We in L&D need to be aware that that is the environment that digital technology exists in and find ways to pivot our practices more towards that sort of a goal. Of course, there's AI. Artificial intelligence is a huge part of this equation. It underlines everything. Usually when you see AI being discussed, it's usually some sort of image like this. I hate this because it's the robots are taking over. It's not about robots doing things and taking jobs away. It's about humans and technology working together. I personally come from the standpoint if there's something that a computer can do better than me, I should let the computer do that so I can focus more on the human element. That is where organizations are going. That is the transformative nature of AI. It is also a situation where it is not something that you need to do. A lot of conversations I see in our field around AI are, well, how are we going to build this AI-based solution? AI is already there. It's already transforming our lives. We just need to be aware of how that's changing the workforces and adapt our practices accordingly. And we hear about this whole Internet of Things where everything is connected. I'm going to give you a very quick scenario to describe what this looks like in my mind. I have an Apple Watch, and as soon as I put it on, it asks me for a code, and the second it puts it on, and as long as this clasp is done, it knows that it's me, and it no longer asks me for a password, which means that my phone can accept information, but it also can broadcast out. So now it's broadcasting a verified signal that I am David Kelly, that other systems, anything with an internet connection or a Bluetooth connection can read. I walk up to a piece of equipment, not only can it necessarily unlock because it knows that I'm an authorized user, but it can take that machine, which is part of the Internet of Things, can go out to the competency management system and see how well I can use that piece of machinery that I am about to use, and can give me an appropriate layer of support as to whether I am a novice, an intermediate user, or a master. That is not science fiction. Everything that I just described in that scenario, the technologies already exist to do that, and people like the vendors downstairs are working on packages that can deliver that sort of an experience. But the framework and all the individual pieces needed to make that experience happen already exist. And that's how the Internet of Things is going to be transforming the work that we do. So, with that, what does this mean for L&D? It means that we have to look beyond just learning and development. We need to look beyond just training and look at the ecosystem that surrounds our workforce and how we support people in different ways. Anytime you're seeing this idea of an ecosystem approach, that's what we're talking about, looking beyond just training. We hear about this idea of learning personalization. We heard about it earlier today. I don't think that it's there yet. Most of what I see people advertising as we do personalization is more recommendation and recommendations, personalized recommendations, which is different than understanding the context like we heard about today in the keynote. And it brings me back to this idea of digital learning. Digital learning to me is about learning. If you're talking about learning, if you're talking about digital learning, look at the language that you're using. Are you talking about learning behaviors, or are you talking about training and education behaviors? The ability to transform our practices and be ready for some of these trends is if we're talking about this in the context of behaviors that are describing learning, what the learners are doing, not what we're doing, and how we're responding to those changes. With that, I want to remind you of that URL. My slides will be there, resources will be there. Anything that people want to learn about more, my contact information will be there as well. But with that, that's my overview. We're going to go more into the weeds with Chris.
Thank you, David. while Chris is setting up, could you just put your hand up if there's a spare seat next to you? I see there's quite a few here. So people at the back, if you don't want to stand, follow the hands and find a seat. All right, there's plenty of seats around, especially here in the middle and over on the side over there. And over there as well. I see that hand. I feel like an evangelist. Right, okay, so our next speaker has flown even farther than Dave, would you believe? Dave flew in from New York. Our next speaker flew in from Seattle, Pacific Coast. My gosh. Chris Pirie is our next speaker, and he comes all the way from there, as I say, but he comes from Britain originally, don't you, Chris? So he's a Brit from America. And Chris is actually the founder and also the CEO of the Learning Futures Group. And it's a great privilege to have you here, Chris. Over to you.
Pleasure. Thanks a lot. How are you? Everybody feeling good? Yeah. Still got good energy? You want to have a quick stand up and sit down? No, you're all good. Great. I have been thinking a lot about this question for my entire career, actually. How will technology change the future of learning at work? And I'm sure a lot of you are here investigating that question this week, right? It's the Learning Technologies Conference. I wanted to take a little bit of time at the beginning to suggest another approach that you might take, and I'm going to explain why that is. I'm going to suggest, when my slides move, I might have a problem here, that the real question that we should all ask ourselves as we look at all this great technology around us is how can we help our colleagues thrive in the future workplace? In the workplace that's absolutely changing, and per David, being disrupted as we speak. So I want to investigate those questions with your permission. How many of you would say that you work in learning and development? Good, you're in the right room, I'm in the right room. We should have some fun here. So I would put it to you that we're in the middle of a bit of a crisis in L&D. It's a $240 billion business. Somebody can help me get my slides working here, would be great. $240 billion business. And how many of you feel like we're really on top of the work that we have to do? How many people feel super confident that we can help our companies create value in the future? Okay, that's often the response that I get, and I'm a little bit worried about that. We just get these slides fixed. I'm not quite sure what's going on. I have no idea. Technology. I think there's a lesson here. So I think the point that I want to make is that it feels like we're operating with processes and procedures and technology that is really grounded in the work of the 19th century. And we're facing challenges in the workplace today that are extraordinarily different from factories and piecework and the kind of environment that work was done when our discipline was first emerged. How are we getting on? Okay, well, so I work for Microsoft, so it's my own fault. Yeah. Yes, can somebody call Bill? Let's have a look, see what these guys do. All right, so I'm going to tell the story without PowerPoint, and then PowerPoint will catch up with us. This story starts 6 years ago. I was the Chief Learning Officer at Microsoft, based in Seattle, and I'm responsible for 42,000 people who work for Microsoft around the world. And we got a new CEO, just the third CEO in Microsoft's history, a guy called Satya Nadella, and he sends an email to everybody at Microsoft introducing himself. And what he says in that email, which I could show you if PowerPoint worked, is that the thing you should know about me is that I am a learner. He said, I buy more books than I can read, I sign up for more courses than I can complete, and I absolutely get energized by people who go to work every day and want to get better at what they do. So my cell phone rings off the hook. 400 people in my team are calling me to say, great news, Chris. Our CEO is a learning geek. Now, how do you think I felt about it? I thought, oh shit. Our CEO is a learning geek. And it was a really profound moment for me because I happened to know that we were failing the 42,000 people that we were supposed to be looking after. And we were failing them because they couldn't keep up with the tsunami of information that was coming at them every day. Because we pivoted from shipping products at Microsoft on a 3-year cycle to shipping products in real time. And because they couldn't discern the truthful information from the non-truthful information. So, fortunately, I managed to keep my job. And for the next 5 years, I went on a journey with Satya and the rest of the leadership team at Microsoft. And we tried to turn the culture at Microsoft from a know-it-all culture, which you might associate with that company, to a learn-it-all culture. And that was the express work of the leadership team and a number of learning people around the world. And along the way, we had pretty good market cap results, not just due to that, but because of trends in the cloud. But we took a massive pivot in how we sell and enable Microsoft technology, and it was all based on the work of Carol Dweck and the book Mindset. Any people familiar with that? And it's all sort of nicely documented in a book that Satya.
Right and left.
All right. Thank you so much, guys. Good job. And it works. All right. People have expectations like this. This is a reprise. And we have technology like this. Sometimes this might be a good thing. This is where I find out the demographics of people in the room. How many people know what this is? Okay, you're all pretty old. Cool. Okay, so I'm Chris Pirie. I worked at Microsoft. I worked at Oracle. I worked with Josh Bersin. And I'm on a mission now to figure out what the future of our discipline is. Because for 30 years, I frankly committed a lot of atrocities in the name of workplace learning. Learning atrocities, I call them. And I want to make up for that. And I want us to think better and be better about how we do workplace learning. I told you about Satya. He's a pretty good-looking guy, and he's very, very smart. And I told you about the market cap growth, which is pretty incredible. You wish you could do that too. I decided that I would spend the next phase of my career really digging deep on this problem and really trying to figure out what L&D 3.0 really looks like. And I used these growth mindset principles to get this done. And I wanted to document my learning and my findings. And I did that in the context of a podcast, because you've got to have a podcast these days. So I got myself a nice jazzy title. You can find it on your podcast platform. And I got myself a soundtrack. We'll see whether this works. Oh. We tested the volume. Believe me. There we go. Right, you can all clap along. Just give me a little bit of love. I'm having a tough morning. All right, good, stop, great. So I got a soundtrack, and I'm going to share with you in 4 episodes what I've learned about the future of workplace learning, what we have to do about the crisis that we all kind of know we're in. Episode 1 is called, I thought the future would be cooler, because I kind of did. I thought we'd be further along than we are today. So the first thing I did, when you want to learn something and go on a learning journey, you go back to school. In fact, I went to the D School at Stanford. How many of you have studied design thinking and the processes of design thinking? It's wonderful. I wish I'd known it 15 years ago. And the one phrase that has changed my world is the phrase, fall in love with the problem, not the solution. And I guarantee you that everything that's talking to you this week in this conference is asking you to fall in love with a solution. And if you fall in love with a solution and you don't know what the problem is, you'll be in a situation that David talked about where you're applying the same old tricks with new technologies. And you do not want to do that because we have important work to do. I also met my first guest in the podcast. I'm going to see whether this works. This is a lady called Lisa K. Solomon, who is the designer and futurist in residence at the D School. Here's what she told me.
Absolutely. I think thinking about the future, processing what may happen in the future is a skill set and a set of practices that we can all learn. Many organizations tend to do their strategic planning looking at a SWOT analysis, as you said, from the inside out. What is our organization? What are we good at? What are our weaknesses? But that leaves them blindsided to how the world is changing around them. And it turns out if we just put our attention towards those external trends, we can get much better at spotting them, not so that we predict the future, but that we are less surprised by it and we're more able to take advantage of an opening opportunity.
Okay, so it turns out that there are ways to think about the future in very pragmatic and academic ways. You look at external trends, you think outside of yourself, you look for externalities, and you will find the trends of the future. And I love this quote from William Gibson, which is, "The future's already here, we just haven't evenly distributed it yet." And that feels good to me, and I found a lot of people who I think might be the future of L&D. I was going to talk a lot about the fourth industrial revolution, but you're probably sick of hearing about the fourth industrial revolution, aren't you? Yes? You've got to tell me, you've got to give me feedback. Well, let's just kind of do it really, really quickly. So we're in the fourth industrial revolution, that is certain. And we're in the fourth industrial revolution because there's a series of technologies that are changing the world in radical ways. And any one of those technologies, the internet, satellites, big data, all the trends that David talked about before, are all in themselves very radical and disruptive. But when they come together, amazing things happen. Cars drive themselves. Cars get powered by electricity, not by fossil fuels. Business models change. You don't need to own any car because it will just come to you because you can call it from your cell phone, which knows where you are. The world turns upside down when these sets of technologies come together. It's happened about once every 100 years, and it's happening right now. And we know we're in an industrial revolution right now because we have Luddites. Who can remember Luddites from English history? Many of you can. They're actually misunderstood people, but for the purposes of this conversation, let's say in Arizona, where self-driving cars are driving around every day, learning how to be better drivers than humans, there are many, many people who are pissed off about that. And this is a story from a real newspaper, from the New York Times, not fake news. They're throwing rocks and they're slicing the tires of these vehicles because they're afraid. They're not afraid explicitly, but implicitly they're afraid of what this technology is going to do to the world they live in, because it is going to change it in radical ways. There's no doubt about that. If we focus in on the world of work, what we're supposed to support and the process that we're supposed to help with, there's a lot of change going on there as well. The robots don't just take the form of Volvos, they also take the form of the platforms that help people find gigs, okay? There's 1 billion hours of gig work done in the US this week, and that's continuing. It's radical. 1 in 5 Americans, I think that's the number, 1 in 3 Americans have done some sort of gig work in the last 2 years. This is a reality. This is the future of work. It's already here, and it's radically disrupting the process of exchanging your labor for money. Who do you think is the learning department for these people? There isn't one. We should think about that. We should consider that. Okay. So I set up on my podcast, and my objective was to meet people who are doing interesting things, people who are rising to the challenges that I just outlined, people who are moving the ball forward. And I met this guy. He is called Rob Burnett, and he's based in Kenya in Africa, and he gave me a view of the future of work that was chilling, absolutely chilling. Rob is crystal clear on the problem that he's trying to solve. Let's hear what he says.
So in Kenya today, this year, 2019, about 1.3 million young people are going to enter the job market. But according to the annual national survey that we do, and we've done for the last 4 years, only about 5% are actually going to get a formal job. I mean, so over 1 million people, considerably over 1 million young people are going to be seeking something to do this year.
So that's today. That's the future today in Kenya. 1 million people leaving the school system and not getting a job that we would recognize as a job. We'll find out what he's doing about it later in the presentation. But that's a view of the future that I don't really like the sound of. But we don't need to get completely upset, because there's plenty about the world of work today that we could improve on. There are things that could happen in the future that could make the workplace better. For example, this is Kate. She's the Chief Learning Officer at Airbnb. And when she came on my podcast to talk about how she is approaching L&D for this extraordinary company, I asked her what motivated her to be in L&D. Because I don't know about you, but I think everybody who's in this profession does it from a special place. They know that it's a special kind of job that we do. And she talked about her mom. Her mom worked for 40 years in the real estate business. I think she retired maybe 10 years ago. And when she retired, not even a gold watch. No acknowledgement whatsoever. Not because she was a poor employee, not because people were cruel, but because we didn't expect women to work in that kind of work, and there was nothing set up to deal with that at all. Now, we've made a lot of progress on that, but we should remind ourselves that in the US and the UK today, we still pay those of you who consider yourself she and her 13% less than your male counterparts. I don't feel very good about that. I don't think we should feel very good about that. And maybe in a future of work, that's one of the things that we could solve. So I like to be optimistic, not pessimistic. I'm going to finish this episode with a quote from the guy who really started all the talk about robots, a guy called Martin Ford. And you know, whenever we get anxious about the future, Mary Shelley, et cetera, we have monsters and robots as a sort of articulation of that. But I think everyone that I speak to agrees with the sentiment here that the way to deal with a disruptive and scary future is to be a better learner. The best thing we can do for the people that we support at work is help them be a better learner. Not do their compliance training, not learn how to use the next product, but be a better learner, be more prepared for the future. And I think that is a big, bold purpose for the next generation of L&D. In the next episode, I'm going to talk about how we can do that, okay? Because I give this talk a lot, and I talk about all the terrible things that are happening in the world of work, and everybody nods their head and so on and so forth, but I don't hear people talking about what we can do in response to that. And there are people who are doing really interesting things, and I want to introduce you to some of them today. So this one's called Here Come the Learning Scientists, okay? In the future, we'll have learning scientists. And I know this because I've met some today. And that future's here, just not broadly distributed. These people are pulling on the scientific disciplines that exist around us, okay? Just like in marketing, we moved from Mad Men to a science-driven, data-driven discipline, I feel we need to do the same in the learning space as well. After all, our job is to change behavior. So we need to learn from data scientists about which problems specifically we should go after and solve with our learning processes. We need to learn from social scientists about the currents and activities that go on when you get groups of people together in organizations so that we can really tie into the social learning that we know is going on. We need to listen to the neuroscientists. Those guys are on fire right now. That discipline is exploding in universities, and they can tell us a lot about how the brain works. Now, when did you ever think about the implications of sleep for programs that you develop? It turns out that that's probably one of the most important things in terms of people learning effectively and performing well kind of on the job. We talk a lot about sleep, but we're not going to do that today. And then finally, computer science. I mean, you heard from David this amazing waves of new technology that are coming at us. They're essentially free. And we need to use those to help people learn. Not to do what we did in the past, but to help them become learners. Some examples of learning scientists. You've already met Kate Shaw from Airbnb. She runs something called the Failure Academy. She told me that Airbnb, which is an extraordinary company that's disrupted the hotel industry around the world, she told me that she does two things. She teaches 27-year-olds how to manage 25-year-olds. That's amusing to me. And she helps people understand how to operate and learn from failure. She asks everybody at Airbnb to run experiments. And the real skill is to learn from those experiments and move the business forward based on what you've learned. She's codified an approach to living with failure. Very, very interesting.
I have a team of about 20-something people who are all about data. They're data analysts, machine learning. I have another team which we call instructional designers here, and several of them come from a sort of behavioral science background, or sort of to trying to understand the more motivational sciences side. So we obviously data drives a lot of what we do. So the reason that we think our product works well is partly unique ideas and approaches to language learning that we have. And it's partly the science that's out there in the marketplace already that you can learn from, and the sort of theories that you can build on. And it's partly just repeated practice, looking at the data, looking at what happens with people, looking at which combinations of things worked and didn't work, iterating, improving iterations, looking at live usage patterns and live data through our product.
So Jeff works for Babbel. It's based in Berlin. Are you familiar with Babbel? Anybody learned a second language? Get this. They have 5 million learners on their platform. 5 million learners. I don't think that kind of thing has happened in human history before. And he has a team of scientists. He hires scientists to really go deep. Data scientists, social scientists, to really understand who's been successful at learning on their platform, and to replicate that and to educate other customers and learners on how to be effective learners. He's turning learning and how to get better at learning into a science. Really interesting guy, fun episode. Okay, next episode. I thought the future would be cooler. 2 left, if you're following along. This is something that I learned from talking to people in the NGO space. One of the sets of interviews we did was with people who work at International Red Cross and companies who are doing good in the world. I'm really fascinated by their motivation and how they do that. And it turns out that most of them move money to where it's needed, but they really spend most of their time thinking about building capability. They call it capability and capacity, and it's training, okay? And the thing that they taught me is to use what you have. And when you go downstairs and you look around, or you pick out your phone, as David suggested, we have an extraordinary set of tools available to us today. I mean, absolutely extraordinary set of tools. And the story that I want to tell you from this episode was told to me by a guy called Chris Pirie. He's the CEO of Augmented, which is essentially the training group for 300 different NGOs. Like, if you're in an NGO, you have to show your funders where every single penny goes. And what is bottom of the list? Training your people. So they organized into a consortium. They worked with Augmented, and Augmented's essentially their training department. And Chris sees some extraordinary things. The story he shared with me took place on the Turkey-Syrian border 3 years ago. There were a team of Syrian volunteers who were ready to set up refugee camps along the border. Remember, there's 3 million people coming out of Syria because it's a war zone. And it turns out that if you work in the aid industry, there's special language around project management. Project management's essentially the same, but in order to qualify for grants and spend money in transparent ways, you need to know some language and some processes around a special version of project management. This is what Chris and team do for a living, so they had books. Sorry, we can't get the books to where they're needed because there's a war going on. That's fine, we've got eLearning. Sorry, there's no web where we need to put these people. We can send in trainers. Sorry, it's too dangerous. So the result, what they did, was they put together a training program in 4 days using WhatsApp. You all know WhatsApp, right? And everyone has WhatsApp in the UK. They put together groups, they put together study groups, they distributed materials, they did really amazing things, and in 4 weeks, they had 250 project managers who could actually engage and build these refugee camps on the Turkish border. Use what you have. I know in my team, we would have spent 6 months evaluating different technologies, we would have spent a year getting it deployed, and we still wouldn't have got on with solving the problem that was in front of us. I learned a lot from these kind of people, and I love this use what you have mentality, especially because we have such a lot. I wanted to give a shout out to this guy who was also on my podcast. Michael, are you in the room? Stand up. Michael built, you can sit down now because it'll get embarrassing. Michael also used SMS text messaging. In fact, he's built an SMS text message learning platform called Arist, short for Aristotle, with his colleagues at university on the east coast of the US. And he did this because he went to, I'm spacing on the country, Michael. He went to the Yemen, and he found his peers were hungry to learn, but they couldn't even get access to the internet. So he said, I'm going to do something through text. And he built a text platform. Now, you're all saying what I said the first time I heard this. This is bogus. You can't teach anyone anything with 1,200 characters. It turns out that it's a really powerful way to have a very intimate discussion with learners as all or as part of your learning program. Michael is announcing today a competition for anyone at this conference who's a learning designer. They'll get free access to his platform, and if they build a course that I like, and he likes, and Josh Burson likes, then we'll give you $2,500 and access to the platform. So I wanted to give out a shout to Michael because he's doing extraordinary work. He's using what he has, and he's coming from a place of humanity, which brings me to my next I thought the future would be cooler and final episode for this morning. How are we doing on time? We're doing pretty good. Okay. So this one's called the superpower, the human superpower that the robots don't have. And I have someone, I don't know if she's in the room, she's definitely speaking at this conference today, to thank for that, a guest on my podcast, Danny Johnson from Red Thread. Anybody see her last year when she spoke in this session? None of you? Well, you should check her out this afternoon. Super smart lady, analyst, does a lot of work in the learning and human capital space. And she did a meta-study with all this talk about robots and all the anxiety of my job going or my job being coming back. She did a meta-study, a literature research on what differentiates us from other species, and obviously from the robots. And she read all the literature, and she codified it down to sort of 4 points. And the 4 points are there. Humans, uniquely, as far as we know, can imagine a better future. That's a powerful thing. We cooperate when there's no particular personal gain for us cooperating. We tell and share stories, and that's how we organize at such scale. And if you want to read the book Sapiens, that's a very good treatise on that. And then we can develop complex tools to help people solve complex problems. Not just physical tools, but mental tools as well. So when I think about the future of L&D, this is where we should play. This is where we should play. And you could run all your programs through this filter and say, am I really supporting the humanity and the unique capabilities of the people that are working with me? I think it's a useful tool. One person who did that, who imagined a different future, is a guy called Anant Agarwal. Anybody know that name? Probably one of the most influential people in learning in the last 10 years. He is the CEO of the MOOC giant edX, one of really 4 or 5 MOOC platforms around the world that have absolutely changed the way people learn. 350 million people have learned on a MOOC. And I know what you're going to say, they didn't all complete. That's our problem to deal with, not theirs. But I love where he came from. He's a giant of a guy, a very, very smart guy. And I love where he came from and where his motivation came from to work on this problem. Let's hear what he says.
You know, I grew up in India. I went to a small town, grew up in a small town, Mangalore. And then by good fortune, I get into IIT Madras, and which is a top institute which accepts very few people from those who apply. And I still remember in the first physics exam, out of the class of 300, 2 people failed, and I was one of them. And a big part of that was I was simply not prepared for calculus-based physics. while they assumed that everybody coming in had learned calculus-based physics in high school. And since that day, it sort of stuck with me that, how do we create more opportunity for people that don't live in big cities, that can access kind of the rigorous curricula that big cities might offer? How do we reach everybody in the world and create much more a democratized form of education where everybody has equal opportunity to learn? And so when the opportunity for edX came up, it was just a no-brainer for me to jump into it and dedicate myself to it. And so just huge thanks to MIT and Harvard for giving me this incredible opportunity.
I love this story, right? A change in the way millions of people learn was really a result of this guy failing an exam. I don't know how you are on sort of particle-based physics or whatever he failed at. I would have failed it anyway, and it wouldn't have motivated me to change the way people learn. It's a great episode. He's a really interesting guy, and he really comes from a place of humanity, which I think we all should. I'm going to finish with a story from this guy. I introduced him before. Rob, and he is in love with this problem of how can you help people in Kenya who don't have a job. And he started with the technology that he had access to at the time, 10 years ago, and he published a comic. And that comic is called Shujaz, which is the local language word for hero. And it helps people who are basically running small businesses, gig economies, selling phone cards at the side of the road, helping out on a farm. He teaches them fundamental principles of how to be more effective at their business, how to open a bank account. And he doesn't do it in a paternalistic way, he does it through stories. And then, of course, technology moves on. One of the fastest growing adoption of cellular phones on the planet happened in Africa. So now Rob is using social media, and get this, he impacts the life of 6 million people. And he does it like a learning scientist. He understands the data. He knows what's on the mind of these people from surveys and data that he commissions and runs. They pore over the data, they decide how they can best help people, and they use all these social media channels and storytelling to help people be more effective at work. That, I think, is not a corporate program, but it's an incredible thing that we could all aspire to ourselves.
At the beginning, we used comic book because they're...
I'm going to skip his because I just told his story. But I do think that if we believe that work is going to change radically in the short term, and we think we have the opportunity to help people in that situation, now's the time for us to figure this out. We've got to understand what the problem is we're trying to solve. We've got to look at the data. We've got to run experiments. We've got to fail out loud and have conversations with each other around what works and what doesn't work. And we have to move L&D forward. And I'm really optimistic because these people and many others that I talk to are doing very cool things. So as you look at technology today and you connect with your counterparts in this fantastic conference, please have some time when you're going home to reflect on the purpose and what the problem is that you're solving. Thank you very much. Thanks,
Chris. Now's your time to actually start thinking about what questions you want to throw. We've got about 10 minutes before the lunch break. And while you're thinking about your questions, maybe I can throw one at you both. Chair's privilege. I'll throw a quote at you. Professor, yes, sit down, please. Professor, look at the distance between them.
Yeah, really.
It's going to be a debate, maybe. But Michio Kaku, who's a well-known physicist, he once said, and whether you believe in this, I don't know, but he said the future is very difficult, if not impossible, to predict accurately. If that's the case, what are organizations going to do to actually get themselves prepared for the future? Chris first.
Well, yeah, I mean, I met some people who might disagree with that. They say there are ways to think about at least the near future, and you just look at the extreme trends. And there are exercises you can do, like put extreme trends together. So, you know, people are talking about the 60-year work life now. Turns out that anybody born today has a 50-50 chance of living to 110. And so they're not going to be able to be retired for a third of that time and learning for a third of that time. And so you look at that trend, and you apply it to other things and say, what will that mean? What will that mean about work? What will that mean about the university system? And so I think you can, there are techniques for sort of looking into the future, not to predict it, but to kind of prepare yourself and find opportunities.
So almost like meta trends, trends about trends.
Sure.
I'm imagining. So Dave, any?
I would agree, and what I would also add is I think the inability to predict the future is too broad of a statement. It's because you have to understand what is it you're trying to predict? What's the context around it? Because there are things that to your point, there is data that we can use to predict. There are things that data doesn't exist, and in that context, then yes, we can't predict that. So I think a blanket statement of can we predict the future is too broad to really say whether it's a yes or no. You have to get into the context of what are you talking about, what sort of data is available that we can use to base the prediction on.
But one way or another, organizations need to prepare somehow for the future, because it's coming, it's already here. So where's our next question coming from? You put your hand up. So it's Rob, isn't it, over here?
Hi, thanks very much. Brilliant talk, really enjoyed that. So the change that many organisations want in their employees is to be adaptable, to be agile.
Yeah.
By definition, they need to be able to try things and fail. That's something that you need to be in an environment of great trust and comfort to be able to do. But when I look at organisations now, that's not the case. There's constant turmoil, restructures, jobs are uncertain. So how do we encourage them to do that when the context is so turbulent and feels really risky for them?
Sure. There's culture. There's things that we can influence in culture. The other thing I would add that I think is contextual to the work that we do, which is not a direct answer to your question, but I think it's contextual to the answer, is I don't see it as the adaptability and such that you're talking about. What I do see is organizations shifting from an environment where the person who knew the most was the most valuable to an environment where the person who can find the answer the quickest is the most valuable. And that if you had a Venn diagram between what you're describing and what I'm describing, it's not a perfect overlap, but there is overlap between that. And I do think that is something that shapes the lens of how we do our work, is what resources are we giving people so they can solve problems, not necessarily giving them the content feeding that we might have done in the past.
I think this word trust is huge. Mm-hmm. There's interesting things on trust. One is I believe that learning generates trust, like an interaction of people that's around knowledge exchange or learning exchange is inherently a sort of builds trust. You trust your teachers. But there's two interesting things that I would sort of point you at. One is Amy Edmondson's work. She wrote a book called Teaming, and she is a really interesting story. She went to all these top firms and she interviewed all these teams, and she found out that the ones that made the most mistakes were the most successful. And that's like super counterintuitive, right? And it turns out that it wasn't the teams that made the most mistakes, but it was the teams that were honest with themselves about the mistakes that they made and were able to kind of respond to that were the most successful. So Amy Edmondson's work, she's doing a lot of work on trust right now, very, very good. The other thing is the Adelman Trust Barometer. Has anybody come across that? It's a really great resource. It turns out that at this point in history, we don't trust anything. There's never been lower trust in government or society. The one exception is the trust that people have in their employer, which I think is really strange, and I can't begin to explain that. But maybe it's something that we can use to help us in our quest.
Any questions from anyone? Put your hand up and I'll come to you with the mic. Over here, too. Right. So, gentleman first here. I do know your name, but you can say it yourself.
Hi, I'm David. First of all, thanks for some stuff that will really get us thinking afterwards, I hope. I've got a question for Chris, really. What do you think of the role of the learning engineer versus the learning scientist, the people who have to apply it rather than the people who have to discover things?
I'll have to reflect on that. I haven't actually heard that term before, but I understand your point, the people who sort of operate this. I think that, my thesis here is that we just need to operate using scientific method. We have to understand the problem, hypothesize a solution, try it out, see if it works, share out loud, get some feedback. And that's not for these, it's not for special people who live in Berlin and work for language. It's for everybody. It's kind of it's a methodology and approach that I think is super healthy. And you know, I'm very self-critical here. I've done a lot of things because somebody shouted loud, and I've done a lot of things that I knew were not going to solve the problem because they weren't skill or learning problems. And I think we have to stop that and focus on just the things that we know we can influence.
I would add one thing just on the learning engineering piece. And it echoes what I mentioned earlier about buzzwords. Learning engineering is a growing buzzword in our industry. It is also a practice that is not defined at all. Right. There's a lot of work that IEEE and other organizations are doing around this emerging competency of learning engineering, but it is not ready for prime time yet. It is still emerging as to what is different about this practice of learning engineering that adds a unique value. It hasn't really been, there is no agreement within our industry as to what that term means and what the unique competencies are as of yet.
That's good. Good. Yeah.
Okay, we've got time for one more quick question here because your hand was up.
Thank you. Good morning, and great sessions, both of you. Chris, my question was directly to you, although Dave may well have an opinion. You mentioned in your presentation about taking Microsoft on the journey over 3 years from becoming a know-it-all organisation, as you quoted, to a learning organisation. And many organisations are on that same journey or looking to go on that same journey.
Yes.
What would be your biggest piece of advice or learn that you may have come across as you took them on that journey that you could share?
Yeah, everyone wants to have a learning culture now, and if we could just put something in the water, perhaps in the building, it's not that easy. Microsoft are really humble about this. They would say they haven't figured anything out. There's a great blog on the Microsoft website. You can Google it. It's the 10 things we've learned about culture, which the Chief Human Resource Officer Kathleen Hogan talks about. Some of the things that they did to really focus on that sort of culture change in the company. I can tell you it's not easy. You try telling an audience of 300 sales leaders that they have to tolerate failure, and that's a pretty tough sell. So, but good resource there. Also, the book, Hit Reset, is a really good resource on that. And if anybody knows people who do learning culture change, Julian Stodd in the UK is quite interesting on this. I'm interested to hear more as well.
One thing I would add is I think I mentioned my obsession with language. I think the questions that we're asking can often define the answers that we seek. People often ask me a similar question of how do we build a learning culture? You don't. You have one. It's a question of how vibrant is it. It's one of the reasons that I personally like the analogy of a learning and performance ecosystem, because you don't build an ecosystem. Ecosystems just exist. It's a matter of how vibrant it is and what you can introduce to that environment to make it a more vibrant ecosystem. So you have a learning culture. It may not be a positive one. It may not be one that is incredibly supportive. What can you do to make it more supportive? It's not about building something that doesn't exist. It's about recognizing what it is and what you can do to make it better.
And on that note, well, yes, you can applaud if you wish, yes. On that note, I'd like to thank both these guys for, you've come a long distance to be here, and you've filled our minds with all sorts of great ideas, questions, challenges, and I think it's the questions and challenges that are probably more important. And with that, let's go away with that in our heads. What can we do to prepare for the future? How can we maximize technology? So once again, and thank you also for coming today, because the audience make it. So thank them all.